And then we'll turn it over to you, Rick, so that you can kick things off.
Okay. Well, appreciate everyone being here today. I think you're going to find this presentation by Virginia Tech very interesting and helpful, but there's a lot to cover here, so I'll be brief. We've all heard that wildlife viewing is one of the fastest growing outdoor recreation activities in the U.S. And we all in state agencies know that this is both a promise and a challenge for us. Part of that challenge is we lack key data to help us understand and reach these constituents. What do wildlife viewers want from state agencies? What do they think about us? How do they support conservation? How relevant are we to them, and how can we be more relevant? To help answer those and other questions, about 2 years ago, AFLA's Wildlife Viewing and Nature Tourism Working Group teamed with the DARE Lab at Virginia Tech on a national regional survey of wildlife viewers. That survey was made possible by a multi-state conservation grant from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the findings posted last month offer a ton of information on wildlife viewers. And I've sent that link around, but you'll see it again today. In addition to the national regional survey, and thanks to the DARE Lab and the survey's executive and steering committees, about 15 states work with the project coordinators to include surveys of about 1,000 wildlife viewers in each of those states. Of course, Georgia was one of those, which is why we're here today. As we explore these findings, I hope this presentation and your review of the full report lead to ideas about how we can best use these insights to serve wildlife viewers in our state and thus better fulfill our agency's mission. To that end, I'd like to thank the WRD staff who helped review questions and decide what to include for our state-specific survey. We had a sounding board of about 9 people and represented all sections. The project was also helped by the guidance of others in headquarters in the wildlife conservation section. And I really appreciate Virginia Tech for their expertise and professionalism in answering all of our questions. We had a few, and their flexibility too in rescheduling this webinar when Ian was headed our way. So I know this group today is going to have a lot more questions, and those are welcomed. I think the better we understand the data, the better we'll be able to determine how best to use it to engage wildlife viewers in Georgia. So with that, Ashley and Christy, I'll turn it back to y'all.
All right, thanks so much, Rick. And I also want to add a thank you in here for you being the key rep from your state agency and for being really engaged and involved as part of our steering committee throughout the whole process, and also being a great liaison back with your agency. So yes, thank you everybody for being here today and welcome. We're happy to be able to have this webinar with you, and hope that you all did okay through Hurricane Ian. I think it went a little bit north of you and south of you, but certainly understand that it was still a stressful time for you. So as Rick shared, we're talking here today about the Georgia results of the Wildlife Viewer Survey. And here's a link, QR code, as well as a link in the chat pod for the survey report. What I want to point out is that we're not going to be able to cover everything in there. It's quite long. We're going to stay focused on what we think are the key findings for you all to be considering as you think about what your agency might want to do next, as well as key recommendations. That said, there might be specific data that's even more important to you in your specific job. So definitely skim through there, find the sections that we talked about today that are most of interest to you, and dig in further. In many cases, we'll just show you the top responses that people had for a certain survey question, but there may be a bunch of other things that we asked them about within there. So check that out. There's also an executive summary if that's something that would be useful for you to share elsewhere in the agency or with any partners. And you're welcome to share the report with anyone that you'd like to share it with. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the team that wrote this report. Christy was the lead author on it. Additionally, Emily Singular, a master's student who's been involved in the project along with Christy, was a co-author on this report. The two of them have really been the backbone of all of these state reports, as well as the national and regional reports. And they're part of a broader team at Virginia Tech who's been engaged in the whole entire project, as well as all those state agency reps that Rick mentioned. And all of this has been done in partnership with the Wildlife Viewing and Nature Tourism Working Group of AFWA through a multi-state grant. So what we're hoping that we can cover here today is how Georgia DNR can best support wildlife viewers, broaden relevance to wildlife viewers who do not hunt or fish, as you'll see that you've got a bunch of viewers who hunt and fish who have a closer relationship with you, but then those viewers that you don't already have as strong a relationship with, we're really going to dig into. And then also how the agency might develop financial support opportunities for wildlife viewers that are distinct from the type of opportunities that are targeting more hunters and anglers. So those are the key things that we hope to cover. Certainly, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat pod. I might not answer them at the time that you ask them, but we'll certainly make sure that we come back to them at the end. We're going to have plenty of time for conversation, discussion, and for hearing any ideas that you have about application of the results as well. All right, so a little bit of a background on the survey first. When we talk about wildlife viewers, this is the type of wildlife associated recreation that we were talking about. People who are intentionally observing, photographing, or feeding wildlife, visiting parks or natural areas to observe, feed, or photograph wildlife, and maintaining plantings in natural areas for the benefit of wildlife. This definition was adapted from the 2016 National Survey of Wildlife-Related Recreation, and actually very similar definition to previous versions of that survey as well. We understand that some state agencies are not in support of or interested in feeding of wildlife, but we wanted to maintain consistency with the previous surveys who've studied wildlife viewers. That said, you'll also see that later on we split out feeding birds from feeding other types of wildlife. I also want to point out that secondary wildlife, such as someone who just happens to see some wildlife when they're outside during the day, is not included in this definition. So we're trying to get at that close observation and intentional observation and involvement. So as Rick alluded to, there's trends in wildlife viewing across the US that are mirrored within Georgia that have led a lot of state agencies to have a strong interest in better understanding wildlife viewing. In Georgia alone, about a quarter of the adult population is believed to view wildlife based on that US Fish and Wildlife Service survey that I mentioned previously. And over time, that participation rate is increasing. If we look at the national level data from 2011 to 2016, you see an increase of 14.3 million additional viewers. And a lot of that increase in viewing comes from people who are saying that they are viewing around their home. And this was even before the pandemic. So we're talking about people either looking out their windows purposefully, feeding birds or wildlife outside their home, and a variety of other ways they might be engaging with wildlife at home. So we're going to come back to that today. You'll see some data that we have that is in line with that. And so it's really important for agencies to think about that component. At the same time, hunting rates have declined or remained stable. So agencies are really interested in how can we broaden our relevance to a larger group of members of our state by thinking about ways that we can have a closer connection and relationship to wildlife viewers. So as we started the multi-state grant project that Rick mentioned a couple of years ago, we asked the state agencies who were involved, Georgia DNR included, why is it that you're interested in having this information, so that we could keep that in mind as we conducted the survey research. So of course, those trends that I just mentioned came up, and keeping in mind that viewers are growing in number, they also have potential to be an influence, positive influence or negative influence on agency programs, general agency support, or various policies that an agency might be putting forth. They also can be pretty difficult for agencies to reach. While you have a great database of hunter license purchasers, fishing license purchasers, or maybe also things like wildlife management access permit, you don't necessarily have an easy database for how to reach viewers. So a lot of agencies were saying, we don't know how to reach out to them and get to know them better. And then generally, there's a lack of information on viewers' thoughts, preferences, and behaviors in a lot of states. While you may have information on how much money they spend or what type of viewing they're interested in from the national survey, there tends to be a lack of information that drills down on what's their attitudes, what's their level of skill, how do they really relate to our state Fish and Wildlife Agency. Agencies were interested in this information because they could better serve and communicate with viewers if they knew a bit more about them. And they also realized that a lot of underserved groups, marginalized groups, urban populations could be part of the viewing population, whereas they might not be as likely to be part of the hunting and or angling population. And then agencies were also interested in how could they connect viewers to mechanisms to contribute financially. Of course, interested and concerned about the decline in some of their license sales, and also aware that additional funding might be possible if they had more matching support from those viewers. So all of these priorities were kept in mind as we worked on this research, and is probably on this list, I would guess, somewhere in there, priorities that you might have for why you're interested in this information as well. So what I do want to acknowledge is that there is literature out there on wildlife viewing. While it might not be specific to the state of Georgia, there are national level studies, there's studies in a variety of different states. And we started the project by doing a literature review of this research. Emily, as well as another master's student who works with me, Kelsey Jennings, did a literature review and then summarized it in this document that I'm sharing here with you. It's really easy to read, nicely distilled under key headings like what do viewers like to do? And that can be a really good resource for you if you are interested in what's been found in previous studies, but don't have time to read that literature yourself. If you are interested in digging up one of the papers, though, there is a reference list for you as well. So that literature review not only serves as a resource for you, but also helped inform how we designed the survey. As Rick said, this was part of a larger project funded by a multi-state grant where we have findings from the national and regional wildlife viewer survey. If you're interested in how your results compare to what's going on in the Southeast or with the nation as a whole, you can check out the findings in there. It's split out regionally as well as nationally. So that's also a resource for you. And for the states that didn't have a state-specific survey, it can be a place to point any of your colleagues who might be interested as well. I should also say we have a recording of a webinar that we provided of those results too. And if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out to us. It's on our YouTube channel. All right, so I'm going to turn things over to Christy, who's going to tell you a little bit about how we conducted this research.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christy Batatsky. I'm a PhD student in Dr. Dayer's lab, and I joined the Wildlife Viewing Project in January as a research technician, and I've continued to work on the project as I've started my PhD, which is on bird feeding. So wildlife viewing is basically my life inside and outside of work. So I know basically everything there is to know as of now. So I'm going to dive into our survey methodology. The survey was part of a project, as mentioned, nationally, and it was one of 15 states in which we completed additional sampling. So we had a goal of reaching 1,000 respondents in Georgia, and we did reach 1,018 respondents. And the survey was conducted fully online through a Qualtrics, which is a panel survey company. And when survey respondents complete the survey successfully, they're then provided with a small financial compensation. The survey ran from October to December 2021, and it consisted of 117 survey questions. So those were written in a way which could apply across all states in the US. But then for this survey, a number of them were then specifically adapted for Georgia DNR. And so our second question following the consent question was our main question, which read, in which, if any, of the following forms of wildlife viewing have you participated in the past 5 years? And then listed seven forms of wildlife viewing, including feeding wild birds, traveling to national parks and areas to view wildlife, and photographing wildlife. And if wildlife viewers indicated they had not participated in any of those 7 forms in the past 5 years, the survey then ended for them. And I think it's really important to emphasize that because our survey results and our survey sample consist of wildlife viewers and not those who don't participate in wildlife viewing. So we don't have a comparison of people who don't participate in wildlife viewers. We're really digging into who wildlife viewers are in Georgia. So those 117 survey questions, which took about 10 to 15 minutes to complete, covered a range of topics, including respondents' demographic characteristics, their viewing behaviors and interests, the duration, location, and frequency of participation, their participation in other outdoor recreation, including hunting and fishing, which we'll get into, but other activities, including hiking, camping, and swimming, their level of specialization in wildlife viewing, their wildlife viewing related expenditures, their barriers and their social support in participation in wildlife viewing, and their likelihood of participating in conservation behaviors. And in addition to that, it also included questions about their familiarity with, perceptions of, and trust in Georgia DNR. And those questions were directly naming Georgia DNR itself, their experience with Georgia DNR programs and services, their past financial contributions to Georgia DNR. And both of those sections were then specifically designed for what Georgia DNR currently has available, as well as their likelihood to support Georgia DNR financially and through conservation behaviors in the future, and their preferred forms of viewing support and communications from Georgia DNR. So a lot of data, a lot of things, and we implemented a measures to ensure that our data was of high quality, including attention checks and a minimum completion time. So these attention checks were a set of questions throughout the survey, which then had multiple statements within them, which sort of contradicted each other. So, for example, there's a strongly disagree to strongly agree question based on wildlife viewing has a central role in my life. And the same question for wildlife viewing is not an important part of my life. And if for some reason a respondent clicked strongly agree to both of those statements, it's sort of a sign to us that they weren't fully reading the question or they're speeding through. So if a respondent produced inconsistent responses to 2 or more of those attention checks, they were then removed from our sample. In addition to that, we had the minimum completion time, which was based on a pilot survey. So it was about 6 minutes. If they went faster than those 6 minutes, they were just basically speeding through all the questions in order to receive that tiny financial compensation. They were also removed from our survey sample. Back into our data analysis. We use descriptive statistics for our statewide results, as well as chi-square tests and t-tests to explore differences between consumptive and non-consumptive wildlife viewers. And I'll get into that much further and what consumptive and non-consumptive means and how we define that. But I first want to emphasize that the data set for Georgia is now openly available for further analysis. So if there's anything that you see in the report or in today's presentation that you want to take a further look at, we now have the data set online through Figshare, and it not only includes the survey data set as a CSV file for those who use R or Excel to analyze data, and as an SAV file, which is used in SPSS or the statistical package for social science, which is what we use to analyze data. There's also a PDF of the survey instrument itself, so you can dive into the wording of the questions and look at what you want to dive into, and an Excel file that has all of the variable names, because there are hundreds, as well as an explanation of their values. So I have sent that link in the chat, and I hope everyone has fun with it, as much fun as I had. And now I think we're going to dive into some of the explanation of consumptive and non-consumptive viewers and explain that analysis. So as I mentioned, we looked at wildlife viewers' participation in other outdoor recreation, and those who selected that they had hunted or fished in the past 5 years, we classified them as consumptive wildlife viewers. And those who didn't select that they had participated in that, we defined them as non-consumptive wildlife viewers. And it's important to note that it's not really a clear-cut division of consumptive and non-consumptive viewing. Sometimes people have a perception that non-consumptive activities don't have a negative impact on wildlife, but it can include mortality. And there are forms of consumptive recreation like catch and release fishing, which might not necessarily result in the death of an animal. But we chose to use these classifications to explore our data through, because non-consumptive wildlife viewers and people who participate in non-consumptive forms of outdoor recreation might not have a strong relationship with state agencies because they don't have that prior experience with hunting and fishing licensing procedures. So diving into more of what happened in Georgia, we had 51% of our wildlife viewers also participated in hunting or fishing, and 49% did not participate in hunting and fishing. And this was a little bit higher than the national values, and that was about 46% of wildlife viewers nationally were classified as consumptive wildlife viewers. And looking in more specifically at those consumptive viewers as a whole, 33% of wildlife viewers in Georgia only fished and viewed wildlife. 3% only hunted and viewed wildlife, and 15% fished, hunted, and viewed wildlife. So you can see that fishing was quite a bit more popular than hunting among wildlife viewers, but still across the board, there was a range of participation. In addition to those quality measures that I mentioned earlier, we also use demographic quotas to make sure that we're having a representative sample of wildlife viewers. And so we use those 2016 wildlife recreation survey results to establish quotas based on age, gender, and education of what we know nationally about wildlife viewers already. And we did achieve those quotas in Georgia. And so our mean age was 48. For gender, 49% of respondents were women, 50% men, and about 1% were non-binary, self-described, or preferred not to disclose their gender identity. And 29% of respondents had more than 4 years of higher education. So I'm now going to take us into some of our more initial findings before I give it back to Ashley to go into more of our key insights from the data. But looking at ethno-racial identity, we provided a long list of ethno-racial identities based on the census options, and respondents were allowed to choose more than one option. But we found in our sample of wildlife viewers in Georgia, 72% selected that they were white only, and 28% of wildlife viewers were classified as BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And so they selected something other than white. And looking more closely at those numbers, 75 respondents selected that they were white or something else, 20% Black, 3% Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish, 3% Asian, 2% Indigenous, and 2% other. And this was quite a bit higher than our national results for BIPOC individuals, which is about only 18% BIPOC. In terms of household income, over half of respondents reported a total household income of $49,999 or less, while 17% reported a total household income of $100,000 or more. And this was pretty much similar, but a little bit lower than the national results. And now we can start to see some of our graphs, and I just want to run through what they mean before we dive in. So our black and white striped bars, those represent our statewide results, and they have those stripes because there was a slight difference in sample size in comparison to those who responded to the question that helped us define the consumptive and non-consumptive viewers. Did they hunt or did they fish? It was a difference about 2, so it's really marginal, but we still want to highlight that difference. And we did only compare across consumptive and non-consumptive viewers. So that's where we have these statistically significant differences. There were none for their residential location, but we can explain that more throughout all the graphs in the presentation. But as you can see for the self-reported residential location, so this wasn't based on zip code, this was based on their own idea of where they lived. The majority, or 61% of people, lived in an urban area or small city, but it was pretty balanced across those groupings that we had. And here we're going back to that screening question, so the forms of wildlife viewing that people participated in. And here's where we start to see some statistically significant differences between consumptive and non-consumptive viewers. So statewide, the most popular forms of wildlife viewing were visiting parks and natural areas to observe wildlife, as well as feeding wild birds. And nationally, this was pretty similar, except that feeding wild birds was the most popular activity. And so you can see for a large number of the forms of viewing, there are strong statistical significant differences between consumptive and non-consumptive viewers. In all cases here, a higher percentage of consumptive viewers participated in a given form of wildlife viewing. And you're going to see this across our results, is that consumptive wildlife viewers are more broadly interested in wildlife viewing. They may participate more intensely or more broadly, more generally, and they have higher levels of familiarity with Georgia DNR. So it's something to keep in mind for the rest of the presentation. But with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Ashley to get into our 5 key insights.
All right, thanks so much, Christy. So Christy's giving you a nice background on who are these people who took the survey, and she just alluded to a key finding that you're going to see carry through a lot of what's yet to come. So the way we organize this next section of our results is by the key insights. So we have 5 key things that we want you to keep in mind as you walk away from this survey presentation. And we've associated that with the data that supports whatever it is that we are recommending as that insight for you to take away. All right, so here they are up front for you. So here are the few things that you could do to better support wildlife viewers in Georgia. One is provide more wildlife viewing information and access. Those are very much of interest. 2 is promoting around the home viewing opportunities in particular. 3 is developing social support networks for wildlife viewers. And I'll talk more about the data behind all of these, as well as what I mean by this idea of supporting social support networks. And then additionally, thinking about broadening relevance to wildlife viewers who do not hunt and fish, and developing financial contribution opportunities for wildlife viewers would again be things that the data provides evidence for how you could go forth and do that. All right, so let's start with number 1 here, providing information and access. We gave people a long list of all the things that their state agency could do that would better support their wildlife viewing activities. And those related to information and also access came up again and again as the top things that people were selecting. So 43% of the viewers in Georgia said they want more information about where to go see wildlife. They want more information about the wildlife in Georgia, and they want more information about how to view various types of wildlife. They also were interested in access to more places to go wildlife viewing. And then additionally, your state was different than some of the others. They also called out the desire for more amenities for wildlife viewing at those locations. But you can see it's only about 1/3 of the sample compared to some of these others that are a bit more getting closer to about half of our respondents. And when we said amenities, we also spelled out to people that we were talking about things like viewing platforms, viewing blinds, or signs at those locations. So thinking about what this might mean for the agency, you have a nice website for folks who come to find out more information about your agency. And as you can see, there's really an apparent desire amongst your viewing public in your state for more information resources on wildlife viewing in Georgia. And the agency started to do that with resources for wildlife viewing through the Go Outdoors Georgia app. And then also the Georgia Birding and Wildlife Trails website. But you'll note here, the key things that people see that are available to them when they come to your website are not as tied in to wildlife viewing. And this could be an opportunity for you to consider, is this could be a place for you to connect with viewers right up front on your website and expand their awareness and ease of access regarding the resources in Georgia by building out that information on your website. So for example, here we have the Virginia DWR website. We're from Virginia, so we'll call them out as an example a few times, but also part of the reason for that is we worked with them in the last 5 years on wildlife viewing planning in their state, so we're pretty aware of what they're up to. So they've built out a wildlife viewing section of their website, and you can see it has things like where to view wildlife, and then it goes to an interactive map, basics for birding festivals and wildlife viewing festivals that exist in the state, as well as links to the wildlife cameras that they are either sponsoring or co-sponsoring with others in the state. So all that information for viewers is consolidated in one location. And you can also see, if you look in the upper left-hand corner of the website, that there's actually, it's a little hard to tell on my screen. Hopefully you're not looking at as small a screen as I am, but there's actually a viewing link there available at the same level as hunting, fishing, and boating. Now, when you think about who you're providing information for, it's important to keep in mind what is the skill level of most of your viewers in your state. And I think that most agencies, as well as many conservation organizations, hear from the viewers who have higher level of expertise, the viewers who are already heavily involved in the local Audubon Club, or the viewers who are already really engaged with your agency and just are very engaged wildlife recreationists in general. But if we think about the viewers as broadly, who are the viewers in the state, we find that it's a really different skill level than what you might be hearing from. You have lots of beginner and novice viewers. In fact, 65% of your statewide viewers identify as such. And you can also see that, interestingly here, the statistically significant differences did exist amongst these groups, and you see that the non-consumptive have even more in the beginner category. So if you're thinking about viewers who don't have experience with hunting and angling, they're even more likely to be that beginner group. Almost 50% of them are. So really important as you think about how you're going to present that information, to keep in mind that you're talking to a beginner viewer if you're trying to talk to the general viewer within your state. And then if you're thinking about how to talk with them as well, which I know is always the next question after we bring up what are they looking for, they are saying that they're interested in website information. Of course, always the challenge is getting people to your website. But it is that web resources are of interest to people, as well as email updates and printed materials. So sort of those bread and butter types of communications are indeed what people are saying are the ways that they would like to receive information from Georgia DNR. I should point out, though, that we did give a variety of additional options, and you can dig into this in the survey report, and you'll see that there's social media, various types of social media. We have the percent of people that are interested in it. And again, we're looking at viewers generally here, everybody who responded in your state. If you were interested in a certain age cohort, you could pull up the data for your state, as Christy shared the link with you before, and you could look specifically at those different age cohorts, because there are some differences across various ages and probably other ways of slicing and dicing the data, which there are endless ways to do so. And then, of course, there's this question with people's interest in more access. So the question for all of the states as they look at this similar result that they saw is, do people really need more opportunities for access, or do they need to be aware of the opportunities that exist for access? We don't necessarily know for the survey respondents how informed each one of those individuals is. So what we've encouraged states to think about is, one, making sure that it's really easy for people to find information about how to access the locations that exist, and then think about the coverage of locations across your state, how easy it is for people to get to them, how close they are to urban areas, because you saw that a lot of the respondents were living in cities or small cities. And in many states, there aren't as many viewing opportunities there. So it's an important thing to reflect on and think about both of those strategies to address this issue of improving access. Of course, you have the Georgia Birding and Wildlife Trails, which is a great way for people to be able to find all of those sites that exist for viewing, or not all of them, but those that have been vetted and you're encouraging people to visit. And thinking about, are there enough urban sites within there, or are there gaps in other types of geography across your state? You all have a wildlife viewing grants program that I know you all are aware of. We were excited to see that you're offering that for expanding access and resources for wildlife viewers. And based on the findings of the results of our survey, people are really interested in going to state managed lands. Now that can include state parks, as well as more specific wildlife management type locations as well. And these could be locations to focus on enhancing those amenities or infrastructure because they're ones that you or other partner agencies may be involved in managing, and it may be easier to do that than at sites for others, although your viewing grants program may provide opportunities there. So those are some things to think about as you think about improving access. Now, in terms of barriers, they really do link in with what we saw with those top things that people needed for support. There's distance to viewing locations came out as the top barrier, lack of free time following behind it, and financial costs. And those can often be tied to it also being a challenge for people to go elsewhere or go farther, go afar from their homes to view. So keeping viewing opportunities easily accessible, close by to where you have population centers, or even at or near people's homes is again a key way to reach out to a broader group of wildlife viewers in your state. All right, Christy, so tell us about these around the home viewing opportunities.
Right, so one way that DNR can serve a greater number of wildlife viewers is by attacking those barriers and promoting around the home viewing activities. So as Ashley said, over half of respondents participate at state managed lands like state parks, but 75% of wildlife viewers statewide participate at their own home or property. And that was not statistically significantly different between consumptive and non-consumptive viewers. And so you can see through this chart, the rest of the other locations, there was a statistically significant difference except for the tribal lands, in which participation was low for both groups. So providing access to around the home viewing opportunities and information to people about how they can view around their home can be really important for wildlife viewers, particularly those non-consumptive viewers, for which that was really the key area where they participate in wildlife viewing. As DNR is already discussing opportunities to join with partners in establishing these wildlife and birding trails, we emphasize that a key strategy for growing around the home and other local viewing opportunities in Georgia will be for DNR to collaborate with partners already more active in this arena, such as Georgia Wildlife Federation, Georgia Audubon, and the Garden Club of Georgia, which I'll now get into a little bit more about the Garden Club of Georgia. So one opportunity for growth in around the home viewing for wildlife viewers is the encouragement of planting wildlife habitat at home. Remembering that list of forms of wildlife viewing, planting and maintaining natural habitats was the least popular form of wildlife viewing, which was surprising to me, but I think important to realize that DNR can then encourage wildlife planting. And one key way that that can be framed is by framing it as feeding wildlife, right? So instead of just providing food to wildlife in the form of feed, you can frame it in a way that planting native vegetation provides habitat and food for different animals. And through collaborating with the Garden Club of Georgia at home with the Community Wildlife Project that you already have, it could be positioned as a springboard for deeper involvement with DNR among wildlife viewers. In addition, DNR Wildlife Resources Division's Forestry for Wildlife Partnership, which has lowered its minimum acreage for participation while still targeting large landholders, and the agency's voluntary public access and habitat incentive programs could both offer avenues to further expand wildlife viewing opportunities across the state, particularly with this planting and managing wildlife habitat around the home. Our third recommendation is for Georgia DNR to develop social support networks for wildlife viewers. This is really important, particularly for those groups who are underserved, including Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Family and friends across wildlife viewers were reported as the most commonly used source of encouragement for their participation in wildlife viewing. And we identify a need for growth in the role of mentors in wildlife viewing. And we see this as a role that Georgia DNR could potentially fill or foster. A reason why creating structures for social support is so important is the don't loop. And this is a theory which was first described by John Robinson and seeks to explain the lack of BIPOC participation in birding specifically, especially considering that level of 28% of wildlife viewers in Georgia were BIPOC individuals. This don't loop really comes into play. And basically what it means is that if you don't meet others who are engaged in a particular activity like wildlife viewing, the odds are you will not take interest in that activity yourself. And if you don't know other people who participate in this activity, the likelihood of you starting to participate in this activity on your own is much lower. And so one case study that we want to highlight, and we go into this much further in our regional report that I sent the link to, but in South Carolina, they have really brought a big focus on BIPOC community and engagement. And they started in 2015. They hired a Hispanic outreach coordinator who developed bilingual resources and developed outreach strategies to communicate with this group. And it was so successful that they then expanded this in order to reach the Black and African American population for participation in outdoor recreation. In addition to that BIPOC group, we also looked at issues with accessibility challenges in wildlife viewers. So we had a question which used the definition produced by Birdability, which is a nonprofit organization which works with birders with disabilities. And we provided this definition developed by them to look at the extent of accessibility challenges experienced by wildlife viewers in Georgia. That definition was the difficulties someone experiences in interacting with or while using the physical or social environment while trying to engage in a meaningful activity such as wildlife viewing. This may be a result of a mobility challenge, blindness or low vision, intellectual or developmental disabilities, including autism, mental illness, being deaf or hard of hearing, or other health concerns. And we did find that 37% of wildlife viewers in Georgia experience somewhat to a great deal of accessibility challenges while wildlife viewing. And so given this pretty high percentage, nearly 40%, Georgia DNR could look for opportunities to connect with local organizations dedicated to supporting people living with disabilities, such as Birdability, to collaborate on developing further wildlife viewing opportunities to support these groups. So this resource, which I'm going to send to you now, is a Birdability map, which was developed as a crowdsourced map. So it allows the public to submit sites and explain the accessibility features for birding at these sites. And so you can see of this map of Georgia, the sites that have currently been described are really centered around those urban locations. So it's really important in order to create a more inclusive and accessible outdoor recreation activity, we need to expand the description of those sites beyond those urban areas. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it back over to Ashley to talk about the broadening relevance to those non-consumptive viewers.
One thing I wanted to add on to what Christy just said about the Birdability map is anyone in the public can enter sites. Also, anyone who works for your agency can too. There's a really easy resource that you can follow on the website for how to assess a site. And you can go to the site and then enter your info when you get back home or from the site as well. All right, so let's talk about broadening relevance to viewers who do not hunt or fish. So we're drilling in on that non-consumptive viewer group that we talked about before. As Christy brought up, not ideal names to say consumptive and non-consumptive, but the emphasis here is on viewers who also hunt and angle, those consumptive groups, or viewers who are just birders and viewers. And we assume that that group is a group that you have less connection with, and the data that corroborates with that. So we found that there's pretty different perceptions amongst those two groups and different experiences amongst those two groups with Georgia DNR, as well as past and future contributions to your agency and interest in receiving support. And for non-consumptive viewers, there really is a need to increase basic familiarity with your agency and provide tailored support to them. So I'm going to show you now some graphs and give you a little bit more information on where to go if this is of interest to you. Okay, so that question of how familiar are you with DNR? You can see your statewide data that includes all people who responded to the survey, as well as that group of consumptive viewers and non-consumptive viewers. And the lightest color here is not at all familiar, all the way up to the darkest color where they say, I'm extremely familiar with the agency. Again, this was a self-report, so of course it's people's assumption of how familiar they are with you. But you can see that that consumptive group really feels that they have a lot more familiarity with you than the non-consumptive group of viewers. Most wildlife viewers were slightly or moderately familiar with your agency, and only 13% of the consumptive group were extremely familiar, but even less, 5% of the non-consumptive group were extremely familiar with the agency. In our state surveys, we then explored this even further. We asked people, have you seen the logo of the state agency? And the good news is 80% statewide has said, yeah, I've seen the logo for this agency. So they have some familiarity with you, have seen your agency logo. But again, higher percentage amongst the consumptive viewers than the non-consumptive viewers. Now, the most pronounced differences between the consumptive and non-consumptive viewers were in their experience with programs and financial contributions to Georgia DNR. If we look down at the very bottom of this graph, it says what percent, shows what percent of people have had no engagement in your programs or services in the last 5 years. And you can see that that was 48% of the non-consumptive viewers said they have no involvement in any of your programs or services, whereas it was only 29% of the consumptive viewers. And this is of the options that we gave people here, which did have a focus more on wildlife viewing related opportunities. So the top thing that people did have some exposure to was information about wildlife. And you can see that goes all the way down to interaction with conservation law enforcement. And we'd expect that that would be the lowest here because we're looking at viewers, some of which were also hunters and anglers, but about half of them were not. The other thing I wanted to point out is you see lots of stars, right? So that means there's lots of differences between the consumptive and non-consumptive group. Pretty much across the board there, you've got the consumptive group in green being a higher percentage, having accessed these programs and services. So they're really being reached more, or they are reaching out to you and finding these opportunities more than the non-consumptive viewers. We also asked people about their purchases and contributions that they've made in the past 5 years. And we looked at this in 2 different types. One, the non-voluntary, as we call them, opportunities, like the things that they have to pay for in order to access something. So the fishing license, the lands access pass, permit or entrance fee, a hunting license, and then any sort of required conservation or habitat stamp or fees. Again, see lots of differences amongst those 2 groups and see that same pattern of consumptive viewers having a much higher percentage. And again, it's considerably higher here, even more so than we saw for the differences in programs and services. Now you may say, why were non-consumptive viewers also having fishing licenses? And so keep in mind that sometimes non-consumptive viewers may purchase a fishing license for access to certain properties, or they may have bought them for someone else. So that's why we may have some percentage here, even though they didn't say that they've been actively involved in fishing. We also looked at voluntary types of contributions. So things that people don't have to pay for, they're making the extra choice to do so. So from the list of options, tangible products from the agency were what people had most experience with, followed by your license plates and donations of a portion of the state income tax. One thing that should immediately jump out to you, and hopefully will if I switch between the 2 slides here, is the bars are a lot shorter for all of these voluntary opportunities, and people don't have to pay for something to get their access or to be in compliance with rules and the law. They are not doing so as much. And again, we see that the consumptive group is a higher percentage, but not quite as strong a difference as we saw for those non-voluntary opportunities. We asked people what would encourage you before I talk about that, I want to talk here about common ground and keep in mind thinking about things that are an issue that both consumptive and non-consumptive groups have talked about. And both the consumptive and non-consumptive viewers felt that the agency's level of prioritization of programs and services for wildlife viewing was too low or far too low. And that's about 30% of people felt that. There was a large percentage of people that said, yes, this is the right amount of prioritization in the state. And very few said that there was too much prioritization in the state. So about 30% of the respondents were interested in more programs or services for wildlife viewing, and that was across the board with the consumptive and non-consumptive viewers. I think it's important because often state agencies are concerned that if they start doing more for non-consumptive viewers, their traditional base of consumptive recreationists might be upset with them. And certainly in the case of consumptive viewers, we didn't find that that would be a problem. All right, last piece that I was jumping to a little too fast, talking about financial contribution opportunities for viewers. You saw the ways that there's already some engagement with the agency and some support of the agency. Now let's talk about what they might want to do in the future. We really found strong potential for your agency to engage viewers and opportunities for contributing financially. The percentages that you're going to see here and on the next slide are much higher than what you saw in terms of what they're currently doing in terms of contributions, voluntary and non-voluntary, to the agency. Now, this may be that they're just that people are being a little overconfident about what they might be willing to do in terms of supporting the agency. But we like to think about it as its potential demand for engagement and financial contribution opportunities from your agency that you just need to find a way to harness. So you can see that the top things that people were saying that they would be interested in purchasing in the future are those land access passes or permits, a fishing license, and fees for programs or events. So I did want to call out that fishing license percentage is across our consumptive and non-consumptive participants higher than the number of consumptive participants. So you may have some non-consumptive folks who are interested in getting more involved in fishing, which I know some agencies have been thinking about ways to promote that. Then there's lots of potential as well for those voluntary opportunities. People said they were interested in funds coming from a conservation lottery ticket, tangible products, purchasing those, as well as conservation or wildlife license plate purchases as well. And then thinking about more creative models, in addition, we wanted to point out something that Virginia DDWR has been trying in the past couple of years and might be an opportunity for you to think about unique ways to try to provide funding opportunities that people can contribute to in your state. Virginia developed a Restore the Wild program, which uses the framework of sort of a membership donation. And they have had to really communicate with their public to make it clear that, yes, they're not a nonprofit organization, but they do provide services to the public, and they don't actually in their state receive any funding for that. All of their funding comes from outside of state tax dollars. So really encouraging people to contribute to the agency because they are not doing so otherwise through their tax contributions unless they've done the state income tax checkoff. So the state-specific pass can really increase connection with viewers, particularly non-consumptive viewers, because it really calls out that they're of importance to the agency and that those funds, in the case of Virginia, are specifically tagged for species and habitat conservation, which the survey that we conducted here in Georgia, as well as surveys elsewhere, really emphasized that people are interested in knowing how their funding is being spent if they do contribute to the agency, and they want to be sure that it's going back to viewing opportunities or to the species they're interested in viewing. So in the case of Virginia, they have 3 different levels that people can contribute to, and those have different costs associated with them, as well as different benefits that people gain from their participation in the Restore the Wild program. So it could be something for your agency to consider. All right, so let's talk now about what's next beyond these insights that we've shared. There's lots of potential in your state as well as other states to continue to analyze the data we provided to you. As I mentioned, the report itself goes into a lot more detail, so you don't have to do any analysis for that. But if you are interested in accessing the data set, we provided the link at the beginning, and feel free to reach out to us if you didn't quite catch that. We'll also send it out to all of the participants at the end, or in about a week after we have the webinar recording link available for you too. Additionally, we're hoping to do more analyses comparing rural and urban viewers, because we know that's of a lot of interest to a lot of states. And we have included that in a phase 2 multi-state grant that we have put together. There's also potential to explore things like the role of income level on people's interests, and also how much they're able to participate in wildlife viewing, their levels of specialization or people's skills, and how that also influences their interests in viewing. And then things like age as well. I mentioned that ways of communicating is certainly variable by age. And then exploring even further accessibility challenges and what people's interests are. And we are already doing that analysis. It's part of Emily Sinculaire's master's thesis. So we will have that to share with you. It won't be specific to Georgia, but will be across all of our state data sets, or sorry, our national data set. So I alluded to that phase 2 multi-state grant we submitted this past summer, and we fortunately just heard that we've been recommended by the state directors and the group of folks who are the review panel. It now has to be formalized and reviewed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but we're hopeful that starting in the new year, we'll be working on phase 2 of this project, which, instead of collecting more data, is about making sure that the data is used. We're really committed in our research group to ensuring that our reports don't just sit on shelves and are actually implemented. So we're going to make sure that folks in agencies, whether they be ones where there are state grants or just or state reports, or those that just would have the regional or national level results at their use, are aware of the results and can really think about how to use them. We also are aware that assuring that agency leadership, and whether it be sort of your executive level or division or department level, are aware of these results and what they mean for state agencies who are committed to broadening their relevance to a larger public. We also are going to be putting together a community of practice where we're inviting any and all state agency to gather a team. It can be a small team of people who are interested in coming up with one project for the coming year that they can fully develop and implement. There's probably lots of different ways different people can take steps to work on implementing the results within your agency, but we'd really like to just help support and foster one project from start to finish over the course of a year. So if that's something that a group from your agency would be interested in doing, we'd love to have you in that. There's no cost for the agency. There, in fact, are benefits for you. You'd have some funding to come to an in-person meeting, and you would be able to also have support from your peers as well as from us throughout the implementation. And then finally, we aim to develop a website with various resources that are developed by the members of the community of practice, and also various examples. The in-person meeting that I mentioned is going to be held at the Pathways Conference. This is a great place for not only the people who are interested in the community of practice, but for others who are committed to thinking about how they can reach a broader public, particularly wildlife viewers, and those who may have values different than the traditional values that state agencies have served. The Pathways conferences are focused on human dimensions of wildlife, both the research and the application. And there are also trainings in human dimensions at those conferences. The cool thing about this conference that's happening at Colorado State in 2023 is it's focused specifically on state agencies. So Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies is a co-host of the conference, in addition to CSU and also us at Virginia Tech. So really encourage you to put that on your list of places that you'll hopefully be able to travel to in the coming year. And with that, I just want to remind you that here is the QR code, and Christy can give you the link again for checking out the results and looking further into what we've shared with you. And we're also accessible if you have any specific questions for us. Christy's your first place to go, but I'm also happy to answer questions. I'm on sabbatical this year, so I'm not quite as responsive to my email as I usually would be. And then, of course, Rick is also very tied into this project and has been your state rep to the project throughout. So as we turn to questions, also wanted to point out that there is a really short survey that we'd ask you to take at the end of the webinar. We're interested in ways that we could improve how we're presenting results, and also interested to hear from you how you think you might use this information. So feel free to take that now as you hear us answer questions for others, or we should have time for you to take it at the end. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and we can take questions. And I see that Ted has come off of mute. So Ted, do you have a question for us?
No questions. I just wanted to thank both you and Christy for this. It's certainly, Rick mentioned it would be informative, and it was. So really appreciate y'all's time. A lot of good information. I think I'll probably circle back around with Rick on a few things, but again, yeah, very good. A lot of things to kind of think about there. Obviously, yeah, I think there's some paths that we could certainly strengthen in what we're doing. But did y'all mention the total? Do we have like from the survey at all, did it estimate total wildlife view, or y'all were looking at that other survey as far as total number of wildlife viewers? Y'all are just taking a subset of that, right? I mean, there's no way to apply that to a total.
So we use the number from the national survey to give the number of people that 1/4 in Georgia. We didn't use the same sample of participants. We used a different approach, but while it gives us an incidence rate of how many people failed the question of whether or not they're a viewer, there was also the question before of whether or not they consented to the survey. And then they also pushed the survey to people with different demographics to help us get those quotas. So I wouldn't trust our estimate that we could give you as much as I'd trust the national survey, which is out there to try to figure out what % of the public is doing those sorts of activities.
But you're, in comparison to the national survey, y'all probably did take a little deeper dive, right, into who we consider to be truly a wildlife viewer.
Exactly.
Correct?
So while the national survey only asks certain questions of viewers, because they're also asking questions of hunters and anglers, etc., this really went into the details of, what's the skill set of people, what are the types of activities that they like to do in addition to viewing, all of those sorts of things beyond the demographics and beyond how much money they spend on viewing and where they go viewing. And there's even more questions than what we shared with you here today. We do have how many days did each of these people say they viewed in the past? How much did they view during the pandemic, et cetera? So yeah, we were able to look a lot more deeply into wildlife viewers than the other broader survey is able to.
Yeah, because that's, I mean, generally just looking at it, you go, "Well, wow, 50% of the people there are consumptive, you know, fishing and hunting." So, but if you looked at the national survey, it's like, you know, millions of people are wildlife viewing. So obviously, I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
y'all
The numbers
really
would-
did
the
look
numbers
at
wouldn't
people
really-
who were serious about wildlife viewing.
Yeah. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is a lot of those were folks that were angling as well. Not very much on the hunting side of things. And yes, you're right. Some of those numbers, if you expanded them out, would give you a larger percentage. So they give you a general pulse on lots of these activities, but they're not meant to give you a population estimate.
Well, I've got to run, but again, thank you so much for this. This was wonderful. So,
Great. Thanks so much.
anyway.
And we look forward to seeing what you all do as a result of it.
All right. See y'all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Do we have any other questions or comments? You're welcome to put them in the chat pod. You're welcome to raise your hand. You can just come off the video or come off mute and turn on your video. We can take any of those options as ways to communicate. And then I did also want to just turn things over to Rick. Rick, is there anything that we didn't cover that you wish we would have, or anything that you want to emphasize from the results that you want to make sure that people are aware of?
Nothing comes immediately to mind. I mean, to me, I just look at that whole angling, wildlife view and intersect there as a real potential for us, because I think y'all may be aware, but in Georgia, access to our state properties, at least the ones our division manages, come with a license. So if you can buy a lands permit, but it's much really cheaper, and we get a lot more, obviously, federal tax revenue back if you buy a hunting or fishing license. So to me, I just see that as a real promising area for us, but nothing necessarily that y'all didn't cover per se.
Great, thanks, Rick. And yes, that explains in your state, as we've seen in many others, that the people who are non-consumptive viewers still have purchased a fishing license because they're aware of that opportunity.
Yeah.
See that John has a question in the chat. John's asking about the high number of respondents that describe themselves as novice and beginner, and whether or not we saw that in other states. Yes, we did. We saw that in the states. We saw that nationally. We saw that regionally. So really common finding that you've got a lot of beginner and novice wildlife viewers out there. And unfortunately, we don't have these results over time. What I would love to know is if that's changed at all with the app Merlin. I assume many of you are aware that came out of the Lab of Ornithology, that you can put on your phone and type in characteristics of whatever you've just seen in terms of wildlife, and then it tells you what it is. And now you can even put it out there and just let it listen to what it's hearing, and it will tell you what bird species it is. So I'm interested in whether or not those apps and other opportunities that we've had to really try to bring in beginner wildlife watchers are making any difference in that. So we'll have to look towards the future, since we don't necessarily have information on skill level from the past. This finding is really different than a lot of other surveys of wildlife viewers. So for example, I was involved in the North American Waterfowl Management Plan's survey of bird watchers about 5 years ago, and we found a pretty high skill level amongst those bird watchers. But we didn't have a way of accessing bird watchers generally at a national level, except for the eBird database of people who'd signed up to participate in eBird. Now, while eBird participants, 90% of the observations come from 10% of the people. So you have various levels of involvement in eBird. And we did have some beginners who had just signed up to maybe get the list that came from a bird walk they'd gone on. we still had much higher specialization, but it's not surprising because we were using a citizen science database for our list. So the approach that we used, which is now the approach that the national survey is using, it's now the approach that the wildlife values researchers are using of using one of these panels that you can purchase from a commercial company that gets together lists of just general public members through things like frequent flyer miles programs. Shows that this sort of general public is much more beginner and novice than other ways that we've studied bird watchers. Specifically, I say that because there's been more studies of bird watchers than viewers generally. So I'm thinking and I'm hoping that this is going to really be helpful for agencies who previously haven't thought as much about that more beginner and novice group because they see the results of other research or they hear from that more advanced and intermediate viewer. That said, advanced and intermediate viewers, of course, may also be the opinion leaders in the birding community, or they may be the people who are leading bird walks. So having a good relationship with them because they reach out to many other people can still be important for other reasons. But if you are really thinking about that broad public that you might want to be trying to become more relevant to, thinking about that more beginner or novice level is certainly something that shouldn't be overlooked.
Hey, actually, I do have a question along those lines that you're just talking about. Is the income, because I think normally we think of specialized wildlife viewers, that there are higher income levels, et cetera. Do you think this gets more at that in the sense of this is more your common?
Yeah, so in line with that, we also saw lower income levels. Now, part of it could come from the fact that this is a paid survey effort. So you may have people with lower income levels participating in that sort of survey. So there's to some degree that's playing a role, but I wouldn't say that that's fully describing why you saw the more beginner and novice. But there's certainly an association between how much people can contribute to wildlife viewing or spend on wildlife viewing, which we did look into, and how much income they have.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments that anybody has? All right, so just a reminder to go up one level in the chat and hit that link for a really short survey. I'd love to hear what you thought of the webinar and how you think you might use these results. That will also help us as we think about the next phase of our project and how we can support agencies and making sure that we're providing resources to help them think about how to use these findings. And again, feel free to reach out to Rick or to me or to Christy if you have any other questions, and definitely check out the full report. And as I said, Christy will be sharing a link to the webinar recording in about a week once we fix up the captions on that and make sure that they're accurate. All right, then I think we're done for today. Thanks so much, Rick, for coordinating. We appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you all.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye, everybody.